Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for July 8th, 2022. I'm going to begin with some news items and then move into the one question I did receive. But let's start with developments which are happening in a very rapid pace, and we can see the shifts occurring dramatically with the ongoing collapse and crisis in the transatlantic region and the consolidation of forces in opposition to that, although the opposition is open to working with the West, provided the West drops its neoliberal imperial policies and its war policies. Now, we have from Great Britain, Boris Johnson stepped aside yesterday, although it's still ambiguous when he will actually leave. In the meantime, he appointed a new cabinet of opportunists who will stay until he's finally gone. But don't expect a change in policy. Boris never controlled the policy. It's dictated from the top, and we'll see what happens in the battles inside the Tory party to replace Johnson. But his unrepentant speech yesterday makes clear that he intends to continue to play a role. Maybe he'll show up in some think tank or on boards of corporate cartels. Meantime, the war danger remains. The Russian successes are mounting in Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces are surrounded in several areas. There continue to be desperate calls for help from Zelensky and his government members. But the question is, when will the West finally accept the inevitable, that they cannot win this war, and that it's necessary to order Zelensky to reach a diplomatic solution? How many more Ukrainians will have to die? How much more sacrifice will be imposed on Ukraine for the sake of the NATO and US vendetta against Putin? The diehards are still pushing for a confrontation, for an escalation. As an example, the Foreign Affairs magazine, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is one of the think tanks that's funded by the US and British military industrial establishment. They have an article on July 4th headlined, "What Happens If Putin Goes Nuclear?" And they say that it's imperative that the West prepare for this, especially if the war turns against Putin. He might be inclined to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And they say there are three options. One, do nothing but pile on rhetorically against Putin, use this as a way to try to undermine his standing. Secondly, unleash a nuclear counterstrike. And third, enter the war directly with large-scale conventional airstrikes and ground forces. Now, after Vietnam, after the endless wars, the failure in the endless wars in the Middle East, after the humiliation in Afghanistan, when will these military planners and intelligence experts and politicians recognize that Western military power cannot impose its will the way it used to? In fact, that the question is, why have they not been removed? They're failures. They're threatening the security not only of the Western countries, but of the world. How can they be allowed to continue making policy? Now, we see Johnson will soon be gone. Macron is facing tremendous opposition emerging in the parliament. The German government is completely incapable of dealing with the coming crises of energy, of food shortages, of inflation. Germany's headed toward an economic implosion, and for the first time in many, many years had a trade imbalance, that is, a trade deficit in the last month. The protests continue in the Netherlands, with farmers out demonstrating against the policies of the Green New Deal, which would eliminate 30% of the farms of the Netherlands. At a time when Dutch exports of food are crucial for the world and where hunger continues to be a threat, how can they shut down the farmers? And finally, the Democrats are facing a wipeout in the November midterm elections. As they have no options. Biden is almost a corpse in office, but the Republicans have no alternatives either. So meanwhile, the other side, and by other side I mean the sane side in the world equation, gathered at the G20 meeting in Bali, Indonesia, where there were many bilateral meetings discussing cooperation on food, energy, and so on. Putin announced yesterday that Russia is going to have a bumper crop from its wheat harvest, that it's going to have surpluses, and they'll make it available to friendly countries at prices that will not be subject to speculation by the Chicago Mercantile Exchange or the International Futures Market in France. In other words, it will be directly based on deals made between Russia and other countries. And as a result, at the G20, many nations were eager to speak with Russia and China. The Brits were somewhat missing in action because Liz Truss flew back to London to audition for replacing Boris Johnson. And Blinken continued the line that Russia is responsible for the crisis, for the inflation, for food shortages, supply chain problems, and so on, even as Putin laid out Russian plans to alleviate shortages. So what we see is a West in disarray. The policies of war, the policies of neoliberal economics, the policies of sanctions are coming back to hit the people of the Western countries. Russia's surviving. The question is, will any government be left standing in the West? And if they continue these policies, none of them deserve to be left standing. Now, the question for today, and I really didn't receive a lot of questions, but this one is worth addressing. It's from a Canadian viewer. How do higher interest rates address the problem of supply chain disruption? How does it deal with food, energy, and chip production shortages? What will raising interest rates ultimately do? Well, that's a totally legitimate question. It's a question that people should be asking Jerome Powell, should be asking Joe Biden, should be asking Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank, Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission, and of course asking the leaders of the Bank of England and the other central banks, because their only weapon that they think they have is raising interest rates to fight inflation. Well, how does it fight inflation? The first problem you come up with is that the making interest rates higher will destroy the housing markets, the construction. It will make the ability to finance longer-term projects virtually impossible, even though there's very little money going into production anyway. The effects, the short-term effects, which they're trying for to dampen inflation, is to cut back on the flows of funds that are out there, because it's the volume of liquidity that's been pumped out since 2008, which is the cause of inflation. Well, the problem is that liquidity was necessary because they did not do a bankruptcy reorganization in 2008. They did not do a bankruptcy reorganization in September 2019 when the repo crisis hit. They have not forced banks to force their customers that are zombie corporations. In other words, corporations that are issuing bonds to raise money to pay for debts that they can't cover by their income. That's the definition of a zombie corporation. It doesn't make enough profit to service the interest on its debt. So how do you solve that? By pumping more liquidity into that company so they can go deeper in debt to cover their short-term obligations. That's the crisis they face. If they cut that flow of funds, you risk setting off a chain reaction default crisis similar to what they faced in 2008 with Lehman Brothers. So if you raise the interest rates, you're going to trigger a series of corporate defaults which will spread throughout the entire system. And in the meantime, the higher interest rates will mean that people who have to borrow to live, including people who have to use their credit cards to pay for food, to pay for their utility bills, to buy gasoline at the pump, they're going to be increasing their debt with an inability to service it. Who's going to bail them out? So we're facing a situation where something must be done outside of the standard axioms that the bankers rely on. It's not an interest rate question. It's a question of the destruction of the physical economy in order to sustain the artificial value, paper value, of financial instruments that are being traded by banks, hedge funds, pension funds, and so on. So that way they keep the illusion that people actually have some profit or have some security in the face value that they have in their funds. But if they go to cash those in, they'll find that there's nothing there but hot air, and it will crash. So higher interest rates threaten the survival of every family on the planet. So it's not a solution. That's why the solution that we've put forward, that Lyndon LaRouche worked on for 50 years, to return to the physical economic model of the American system, where you solve these problems by increasing the flow of funds into production of real goods. In the short term, you can't allow the trading of financial instruments that are worthless. So you shut it down. That's what a bankruptcy reorganization is. You force every company to evaluate what they're holding on their books. You force the banks to look through their portfolio to see how much of what they're counting as assets is real and how much is funny money. And you write down the funny money or write it off. But you have to sustain the banking system as the basis for generating new credits. That's the American system. That's what Hamilton did in the 1790s to pay for the debt that was incurred during the American Revolution. And he did it through a report issued called Report on Public Credit, where he said a well-managed debt can be a national blessing. And then he laid out in further reports how you increase the real wealth production so that you can cover the debts that you're taking on, that you're incurring in the process of building the economy. But what Hamilton knew, and what any sane economist should know, is that increasing debt to service old debt is not a solution. And that's why the realm of addressing this is not interest rates, but physical economy, and that's where bankruptcy reorganization is such an important tool. And that's what we're mobilizing for. We're asking people to read and study the Schiller Institute petition calling for a bankruptcy reorganization and a new Bretton Woods. And what's the deal with the new Bretton Woods? We need credit generation that's done on a multilateral basis of cooperation, where you have something hard backing currencies. For example, what Russia is doing, where they have gold, where they have wheat, they have fertilizer, they have timber, they have strategic metals. What's backing the American dollar? We don't even know how much gold there is in the vaults, but more importantly, when the physical economy plunges, what backs the monetary aggregates? Nothing. And so that's why we need this dramatic financial reorganization. And it needs to be done on a global basis because the world economy is interrelated, not the way the World Trade Organization or the Davos crowd wants it to be interrelated. They want it to be controlled from the top by the central banks. We want it based on agreement between sovereign nation states. That's the constitutional basis for the United States of how to deal with global financial crises. We can play a positive role by working with Russia, working with China, working with India. Maybe we can pull the Europeans out from under the control of this London Wall Street debt bubble. Maybe. That's what we have to do if we're going to make this thing work. So thanks for joining me today. Think about this over the weekend, and I'll see you again on Monday.